What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop podcast. We're on a mission to unlock human performance. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop. Okay, we're kicking off Women's History Month here in March, and we wanted to bring on a guest who can shed some light on, you guessed it, women's health. Our VP of Performance Science, Kristen Holmes, is joined by OBGYN and women's health expert Dr. Jessica Shepard. Dr. Shepard is the Chief Medical Officer for Very Well Health. She's the founder and CEO of Sanctum Med and Wellness, which is a wellness concierge practice. Dr. Shepard is also a member of the Whoop Scientific Advisory Council, so we appreciate all the advice that she gives us guiding the company and its products. Dr. Shepard is also the founder of Her Viewpoint, an online women's health forum that focuses on addressing taboo topics in a comfortable setting. Kristen and Jessica discuss what is happening to the body during menopause. This includes the shifting hormone levels such as estrogen and progesterone, how to determine whether you are in perimenopause or menopause. There's symptoms, for example, hot flashes, weight gain, mood swings that they get into, creating the right hormone therapy profile for you, how to deal with the health risks associated with menopause. This can include heart disease, osteoporosis, colon cancer, so it's serious. Tips on how to have a balanced nutrition and good night's sleep while experiencing menopausal symptoms. Turns out the quality of the food really matters. I found that quite interesting. And Dr. Shepard's outlook on the next 10 years of menopausal research and women's health. If you're new to Whoop, you can use the code WILL when you're checking out. Get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. That's at whoop.com. You can also email us, podcast@whoop.com, or call us 508-443-4952, and your questions might be answered on a future episode. Without further ado, here are Kristen and Dr. Jessica Shepard.
Dr. Shepard is a renowned OBGYN and women's health expert. She is the Chief Medical Officer for Very Well Health, the founder and CEO of Sanctum Med and Wellness, and is affiliated with Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. In her Dallas practice, she works with a team of therapists, yoga instructors, Ayurvedic wellness coaches, nutritionists, exercise specialists, and other health professionals dedicated to women's health. Along with writing for numerous health journals like Women's Health, Dr. Shepard is seen regularly as an expert on The Today Show, Dr. Oz, Steve Harvey, CBS News, and WCIU in Chicago, where she is a monthly health contributor as well as guest co-host. And we are so, so grateful to have Dr. Shepard as a member of the Whoop Science Advisory Council. Dr. Shepard, welcome to the Whoop podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so excited, one, to be here, but even more so, so proud to be part of the scientific advisory board because this is something that is like near and dear to my heart. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, when we had a chance to meet, gosh, at the Hologic Vet, that was, gosh, that was November, right,
Yeah.
of 2022.
That was,
Um,
no, remember that was US Open time.
oh gosh, so that was, yeah, so it was even earlier. Well, I knew at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, we need to get Dr. Shepard involved in our mission. There was just so much alignment, and I was just astounded by just your level of expertise and just how you just have this real natural curiosity about you. And you're just, it's not just, clocking in and clocking out. I mean, you have this deep, deep passion for women's health and you want to just get to the
It
bottom
definitely
of it all.
is like this passion. And, what I am fascinated by is yes, I spent so many years in medical school and learning, surgical techniques but it's really the patients that drive the curiosity, I would say.
Yeah.
So, seeing patients, in clinical practice for 15 years, what I realize is that there's so many underlying questions that resonate from this same level of it's like a kind of like a ceiling. Like women know so much, but then above that there's more that they need to know, but they're not quite sure how to access that information.
Yeah.
And I can honestly
Yeah.
say that a lot of the times I didn't necessarily have the answers, which means that we
Yeah.
needed to do a better job with probing these questions and then also advancing literature and science into how is this impacting women, especially when
Yeah.
we're thinking of women who are in their mid 40s through 50s.
Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine it's hard to see women come in, in pain, mentally and physically, and not really know what to do about it, and then I think that's where hopefully our collaboration around just the research and looking into some of this physiological data, we're able to see some signals, and again, I think
Yeah.
it's we're kind of going, we want to be able to understand, how to apply our effort in these during these different inflection points, and hopefully, mitigate some of the deleterious effects of menopause and perimenopause, which is going to be the topic of conversation today. um, Dr.
Yeah.
Shepard, before we kind of dig into perimenopause and menopause, why should guys listen to this podcast? I think it's obvious why women might be interested in this podcast, but why do you think the men in women's lives should have a listen to this?
Yeah, I think that that is probably the most important thing to feature prior to digging into this topic, because obviously women are going to want to listen to this because it impacts them. But I think that when we think of our advocates or people who really truly can move the movement, I guess you can
Mm,
say, of how we see studies going towards, or how we can see the differences between studies that impact men versus women, just on a pure gender bias, is having men into the conversation. Because
mhm,
we really can't explore the impact of perimenopause and menopause and how it truly has some physiologic changes and things that we can do to enhance some of the changes that come during this time frame, unless we have everyone in the conversation. And that's what I would say has truly changed science in general when we look at, say, heart disease. And for years, for decades, heart
mm,
disease research was done mainly on men. And we are still seeing that women still die
mhm.
mostly from heart disease,
Yeah,
um, because we weren't really focusing the studies on women. And so now that we are starting to see how we're able to change some of the guidelines, recommendations when it comes to
right.
heart disease in women, because we're taking the time. And that really came from bringing men into the conversation of how can we make this work for women, and in total everybody, because that's where
Yeah,
we are going to see the impact, is that it really helps everyone in the long run. So I think feel like there is a long game to this, that it impacts men because women are involved in their lives, however that might be, their mothers, their significant others, their daughters. And so this is again the importance of having men in this conversation.
beautiful. So, why don't you give us a rundown of what's actually happening in the body during menopause?
Yeah, this is like the million dollar question,
Right?
because it is not like this light switch. I think that's
Mm,
how we've maybe phrased it or allowed people to understand how it happens, and it
mm,
doesn't happen quite that way. And that's why I like to bring back the conversation to women in their 40th decade,
mhm,
um, because that's truly when you start to see some of those changes. Now, menopause, as I like to say, is actually, if you think about it technically, it is a very clinical term, because what it means is when a woman has not had menstruation, any type of bleeding, for 12 months consecutively. So I have a lot of women who are like, "Oh, I'm menopausal." And I'm like, "Well, are you still menstruating?" And they'll be like, "Well, I didn't have one for 4 months, and then I had one, and then I didn't have one for 3 months." And I'm like, "Well, technically you're not menopausal." And so that's why it becomes a clinical term. So it's kind of like a little doctor talk. We
mm,
know if someone says, "I'm menopausal," that you have gone through a 12-month time frame without menstruating. Now, here comes the other part of the definition, is that's the clinical definition. So once you reach that 12-month, I like to say that menopause really is like one day, because it's that day that you've now reached 12 months without menstruating. And then after that, you're postmenopausal. So it's almost
mm.
like it's your birthday to the rest of your life, because it is that one day.
Mm,
But prior to that, you're perimenopausal. So even while you're going through maybe 4 months here without menstruation, and then you bleed, and then you have, that's perimenopause. But the real focus on what I want women to understand is that leading up until that day of that 12 months consecutively, you are still going to have hormonal changes. And that's where you start to see that downregulation of estrogen, the decrease in testosterone, and changes in other neurotransmitters and hormones. And that happens throughout your 40th decade. And that's
Mm.
why I like to educate more on the front end than just, okay, you reached menopause and now we're here. And then, we've already had all these changes that were happening during the 40th decade. And now we're trying to give you tips and tools. I think we need to bring that back a little and
Yeah.
really get women on the conversation topic of how does this impact your energy
Mm.
utilization, your weight distribution, your, even your cholesterol makeup and how that
Yeah.
changes metabolically before we get to that menopausal stage.
Yeah, beautiful. So, really, the conversation should be happening in the 30s in terms of understanding. I, I
Mhm.
guess, is does lifestyle is kind of the time point of when you enter kind of that perimenopausal menopausal state. Is that genetic? Is that pre-programmed, or is it
Yeah,
something that you can modify with lifestyle?
I think that there's two answers to that question. What we have seen in recent studies is when we actually look at ethnicities and how
Mhm.
that actually can impact the duration of symptoms that you have, the severity of symptoms that you have, and also kind of like the starting point of when you may start to see those symptoms, really do make a difference. And I think that's important as well
Mhm.
because how we can look at ourselves as women differently, through ethnicity can allow us to fluctuate how we're going to incorporate some of these lifestyle changes. And then also, it is very genetically kind of connected as well, you can say. So I like to ask women who are, maybe starting to have some perimenopausal symptoms or have reached menopause or close to menopause. I say, well, and this is a tough one too, because I think we're
Mm.
probably in our first generation of women who are very aware of what the word menopause is and having the
Mhm.
symptoms and remembering, because before it was very overlooked. So, and it was kind of given that, oh, well, you're going through menopause, deal with it. So, like my mother and probably her mother were not able to really give a good historic perspective of what their symptoms were when
Mhm.
they started to feel some changes,
Right.
because it was just kind of like, yeah, this is what's supposed to happen, so just deal with it. So there was
Mm.
no mental recollection of hallmark changes. It was just kind of
Right.
like, well, this is kind of crappy. I just gotta, plow through. And
Right.
now we've changed that conversation.
Right. Right. So if you start, so I guess, what are those kind of hallmark symptoms? I would imagine there's some sleep and metabolic changes, and there's probably a whole suite of things that are happening. What is there an order to that? Does one happen before the other? What can women start to look out for to try to keep
Yeah.
track of what's happening to
I'm
their body?
so Yes, and that's a great question as well because before, and for good reason, we have our most common symptoms of menopause, and that can usually be some of the changes such as hot flashes, night
Mhm.
sweats, irritability, changes in sleep. Um, and vaginal dryness is also another one. But we used to just kind of create this kind of, oh, well, you might have one of these four symptoms. What we
Mhm.
are starting to see in studies now is that really has an expansive look at what that
Mhm.
transition can look like. And so I think the way we use our energy is differently, how our fat cells change. And so you start to
Mhm.
see some of those fluctuations in our body habitus. Women usually will start to gain weight more easily. So even if they haven't really
Mm.
significantly changed their diet or worked out less, they still start to see some changes in how they're gaining weight. It's a little bit
Mhm.
easier. Sleep disturbances, also anxiety and depression, and not
Mm.
necessarily how we typically see anxiety and depression kind of uh, show up in other people's lives. It's this kind of rumination, inability to remember. So you kind of have like this mental fog. um, you start to have disturbances in your sleep, and that can, show up as difficulty falling asleep, but
Mhm.
also waking up. throughout the night and not being able to go back to sleep.
Mhm.
It also libido was impacted as well, and how we really show up in our relationships. Our vaginal health changes, and our body just feels different. There's a lot of aches and pains. I have a lot of patients who are on hormone replacement therapy, which I'm sure we'll get into,
Mhm.
who definitely see some changes in their joints hurting. And it's not an arthritis
Mm.
issue, it has to do with changes in hormone levels as well. So, as you can see, I've probably listed about 12 things uh, that could just be on the tip of the iceberg when we
Mm.
think of symptoms. But we used to just think of it as like the hot flashes, night sweats, irritability. And there's so much more to that.
Yeah. And I think that's where, wearable like Whoop, for example, like, we
Yes.
have this incredible ability to track different things, so
Hmm.
we are more aware of the subtle perturbations, and I think that I think a lot of folks are like, oh, that, the being aware of those subtle perturbations, like, is, makes me anxious. And I think for me, it allows you to course correct before you kind of get to a point where there is no point of return, where
Right.
you develop insomnia, or, like, I think understanding, oh, wow, actually I'm spending a little bit more time awake, or, oh, wow, I have more disturbances than usual. You can
Hmm.
start to take, you can start to change maybe how you're dealing with stress or managing stress throughout the day. You start to ask questions, about
Yeah.
how your daytime behaviors might be impacting your sleep, or is there something else going on? I think it really does, I think, arm you with insight that you wouldn't otherwise have, which can be helpful. So on the topic of sleep, how would you, if
Hmm.
someone is starting to recognize these changes, that's a little bit more difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep, they notice in their data that the quality of their sleep is diminishing, what would be your
Yep.
advice for those patients?
This is a great question because I feel like you're talking to me. I feel heard right now. All those things you just said.
Oh, my
Because I'm
sweet
like,
girl.
how you actually think, how is my body movement changing, how is my flexibility changing, my sleep
Mhm.
habits? These are all things that, and I'm very grateful because I'm, I guess you could say, at the cusp and at the helm of curiosity when it comes to perimenopausal health and how that impacts just your daily life. So I very often ask myself these questions,
Right,
whereas even like I would say 7 to 10 years ago, I wouldn't have probed myself this way. So
right.
I'm very glad that this is my passion now that I'm seeing, because I do see the changes that are occurring in my life, and I'm in my mid 40s. And so this is kind of like where I can say, personally for myself, that it's, coming showing up in my life, and I want to
Mhm.
give back to women who are younger
Mhm.
than me but also may be in the same time frame, that they can start to ask themselves the same question, so we can be much more readily available when menopause comes. Now, how I
Right.
would say when it impacts your sleep, that is so important, because not only is it a question of how can I improve my sleep habits, but I also want people to take a step back and look at how does sleep impact my health, because I think that's a very important conversation to have before just saying, okay, I understand I'm having sleep disturbances, is to really see again the long game of how is sleep going to impact my overall health. And we
Yeah.
know, and I'm sure you can give us really good data behind this, because
Mhm.
that's your expertise, of what we're seeing long term with decrease in sleep quality and
Mhm.
quantity. And that can
Mhm.
show up in heart disease, it can show up in diabetes, it can show up in metabolic disorders later
Yeah.
on in life. And quite frankly, it really decreases the quality of life long term, is what
Mhm.
we've seen in studies. So I think it's important that we understand first that one side of it. Now, when it comes to, I know I'm having sleep disturbances, how do I improve that quality,
Mhm.
is to, one, seek out someone who's going to appreciate the question and
Mhm.
give you some of the right tools and resources to improve that. And I think that can come through a variety of different ways, whether we're looking at hormones and evaluating hormones for how we may be depleted and how to restore them. And that can come in the
Mhm.
form of hormone replacement therapy. You can also look at it from uh, an appreciation of what are the things that are causing me to fall into these categories of sleep disturbances. whether it's I can't fall asleep because my mind is racing. And so
Mm.
that can come in a form of, do we need to look at mindfulness meditation? Breathing techniques, I think, are very important in order
Mhm.
to calm the mind to then
Mhm.
get to sleep. Am I waking up because of disturbances such as hot flashes? And so that
Mhm.
also can come from a neurotransmitter perspective on how our body is looking at those neurons, namely the candy neuron, which was just recently revealed as one of the ways that has estrogen receptors on it. But during menopause, because we have a depletion of estrogen, is that now that interrupts the ability for that neurotransmitter to connect to estrogen, and that can therefore be a cause of sleep disturbances. So,
Interesting.
as you can see, there's all these different mechanisms and what the sleep disturbance is, what is causing it. And that takes a really good practitioner to dig
Mhm.
down into what is happening prior to it. And a
Mhm.
lot of people may not be paying attention to it because they haven't been probed with the question. So once they're
Right.
able to take a step back and say, oh, I looked at this and this is probably why, or these are the symptoms that I might be having. And then also, of course, as we're on the Whoop podcast, we
Mhm.
know that being able to look at your sleep and getting a good
Mhm.
depiction of what is occurring over the course of a night and where those sleep
Right.
disturbances are can help us then pinpoint how do we actually address those. And
Yeah,
so,
without a doubt.
also looking at nutrition, I think nutrition is such an important
It's
feature
huge.
of not only perimenopause and menopause, life in general.
Mhm.
And as you can tell, nutritional sciences is really like taking off right now because finally we've realized that ultra processed and processed foods are not really doing us any good favors. And so
Right.
we're taking a step back and looking how nutrition can impact our overall health. That's also an
Mhm.
important feature.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's a lot there. So you mentioned, what is that moment where hormone therapy is the right path? What's the criteria, I suppose, that okay, I qualify for hormone therapy? What does that conversation with a patient look like? And what are, is it the symptomology that kind of pushes us there, or is it more of like what's happening with our hormones that pushes us there, or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination of two. Hormone replacement therapy to me, again, was something, with the WHI study in the late 90s that really kind of took us off the path of realizing the importance of hormones and what they do for us, specifically during the menopausal transition. And I think we are now realizing, and we did actually, very shortly after the WHI study, when they did retrospective studies on what those issues were that caused them to have to halt the study, and then fine tuning that it was actually the population that was studied that was probably not the best. That in the end, and I hope that we can probably hallmark this, the statement is that hormone replacement therapy is very healthy when done under the auspice of a practitioner who can stratify for risk factors
Hmm.
and then allow for people to understand what type of hormones can be given, how it can be given, and educating well on how to do it in a safe manner. And also the start of hormone replacement therapy is also very important too, like when women actually start. And I like the way that you question that is who is really a candidate, right? And I always say everyone should be considered a candidate until we can maybe stratify for something that would take them out of the running, I guess you could say, for hormone replacement therapy. And that's how I would prefer it to be looked at rather than there are only a few people that are candidates for it. I like to look at it as everyone is can take hormone replacement therapy because it doesn't always necessarily have to be estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. It can be maybe just testosterone. It can be a combination of all. It can be maybe just progesterone. It could be looking at your thyroid hormones as well. And so I think it shouldn't be just looked at as one bucket and are you in the bucket or not,
Hmm.
but how much of that bucket can relate to me from a hormone replacement therapy standpoint that can be very beneficial to me. And I think that takes true understanding of hormone replacement therapy and also looking at more of the recent literature for
Hmm.
hormone replacement therapy to be a good advocate
Hmm.
for women to find which ones are good for them.
Yeah, you mentioned timing. Um, and I, from what I understand in the literature, there that seems to be a really important piece of the puzzle in that, women who are already kind of menopause, I suppose, that one day where they're on the 12th month where they no longer have a period and they're end menopause, hormone therapy potentially isn't as beneficial. It actually is, during that perimenopause phase, when hormone therapy can actually do, have the best efficacy. Is that correct?
Yeah. And
Okay.
that is correct. And, when we think of hormone replacement therapy, we really have evolved over the last few decades. And I think that we know what has become very clear is that the risks of hormone therapy are low for healthy
Hmm.
women less than the age of 60 and
Hmm.
within 10 years from menopause, meaning it is more beneficial to start that hormone replacement. And I even like to scale it back to within 5 years of that
Hmm.
menopausal kind of time clock that we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
to start them as early as possible. And you don't have to wait for menopause to be considered for hormone replacement therapy. I think understanding, the risks and benefits and
Hmm.
also listening to women when they have certain symptoms is really to say, hey, would this be a great patient to start on hormone replacement therapy now rather than waiting for that, what we said, that birthday of menopause?
Right.
And what are the forms? Because, there are different formulations of hormone replacement therapy. So I do believe that there are candidates. Again, everyone
Hmm.
can be a candidate, and how do we actually get them to get some type of impact and benefit from hormone
Hmm.
replacement therapy than actually waiting for that time frame. And
Hmm.
so what we do know now is less than 60 and within the
Hmm.
first 10 years of menopause.
Excellent.
And then again, I like to scale it back to even 5 because I want women to be so cognizant of
Hmm.
going to ask sooner than later, than waiting, until we're like, oh, well, you're kind of a little bit further out from that menopausal time frame. I don't necessarily know if it's going to be as effective. Um, and if we're going to see some of those long term benefits that we
Hmm.
would like to see, uh, than waiting too long, such as heart disease,
Hmm.
such as metabolic syndrome, bone
Right.
health is a big part of that. And then all the other outcomes that we would see that are helpful and the benefit of taking hormone replacement therapy.
Great. So if I have a regular period, so, I am like clockwork, and, there's no
Mhm.
sign that, there's changes in my period, could I still be going through perimenopause? And if the answer is yes, how would I detect that? Is fluctuations across these, estrogen and testosterone and progesterone, or how would I kind of know if everything else seems normal and I'm trying to get ahead of the curve? Asking for a friend.
Well, I think that for you or for any woman that,
Hmm.
is menstruating regularly, usually
Hmm.
that's a good indication that your hormones at a level where they're like still kind of firing pretty
Right.
consistently, enough to elicit a menstrual cycle every month.
Hmm.
So most times you're not going to necessarily have some of those symptoms of when you
Hmm.
start to, I kind of like call it like the dimmer switch when you walk in a room
Hmm.
and you're slowly dimming that light, right?
Right. You can't
And
perceive
you
it's
start to see
happening. It's yeah.
and then you start to see some of those changes. So what usually happens is as you start to dial down and you start to see changes maybe in your menstrual cycle and it's not as regular, is when you might start to have like these spots on and off of symptoms. So it's not what I'm not discounting is that you may not have those symptoms now. They may not just be as regular or severe
Mhm.
as someone who starts to have some of the changes in the menstrual
Mhm.
cycles and skipping those. But that's when I also like to look at what are the things that you could implement from a lifestyle perspective and not necessarily have to take hormones. So, for example, there
Right.
are women who do well on birth control pills at an earlier time frame when maybe they're
Mhm.
not menstruating, but they maybe have some changes in their symptoms. And I'd be like,
Mhm.
that could be a way that we could actually help you with some hormone replacement. I'm
Mhm.
putting those in quotations if you can't see
Mhm.
me. But
Yeah.
also, I think that there are some lifestyle changes that are going to help improve some of the symptoms that you have. So, looking at your
Right.
thyroid. Now, thyroid is the most common endocrine abnormality for women, especially starting at the age of 40. So, you might start to see fluctuations in that. I also say exercise is a very big kind of cure, if
Hmm.
that, for lack of a better term, of how you can offset some of those symptoms as well, and changing the way in which you work out too, because
Hmm.
that's energy utilization as well. And that's
Hmm.
when I start to counsel some of my patients, decreasing a little bit more of their cardiovascular activity, not saying that's not important, but now
Hmm.
implementing more weight training,
Yeah.
right,
Yep.
and really getting that impact there. And then
Hmm.
nutrition as well. I think that there's such benefit to shifting some of those nutritional outcomes, and how we look at food as far as medicine, rather
Hmm.
than um, just food intake, and really using it as a source of medicine. And then also, unfortunately, and I'm sure you've had a lot of, and I listened to Dr. Andrew Huberman on this, is the alcohol intake should
Oh,
decrease as well.
I
I
know.
say that
I'm
kind of,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
okay.
alcohol is a poison, and I mean,
I
this is
know.
one, when you talk about data, I mean, there's nothing that moves around recovery and sleep data
Like,
more
numbers
than
don't lie.
alcohol. They don't. You hit on nutrition too, and it's the timing as well that I think we
Yeah.
underappreciate. And of course, my area of expertise is in circadian physiology. So I spent a lot of time studying this and inside this literature. And I think that's the other opportunity for women, is to really dial in on the timing of things, right? Because when
Mhm.
we age, our melatonin production starts to decline, and that's what impacts our adiposity and our insulin resistance and all of these things that I think really affect the trajectory of how we age and how we feel. And so I think, when you zoom out and think about, all right, how do I, um, and again, I think, it's hard to know exactly if this is genetic or, if this is something that's a bit modifiable. But I would say that from the perspective of doing what we can do to help ourselves, minimizing that sleep wake variability, so really trying to stabilize when we go to bed and when we wake up is going to impact our
I know.
melatonin production, right? And then the timing of food. So I want to hear a little bit about what your prescription for just nutrition, just generally at a high level, understanding that I know this isn't your absolute expertise, but obviously as a medical doctor, you think about all of these things and you're talking to patients. So just
Yes.
from the timing perspective, really trying to
Mhm.
make sure that we're giving ourselves a 3-hour window of kind of ending when we eat to when we intend to sleep. We know in the literature and in our Whoop data, this is very, very clear that this also moves around our sleep and recovery when we're eating close to bed. So there's that timing, kind of that circadian component around timing, that I think is an opportunity for folks. And then, in that, inside that eating window, what would you recommend women take on to really help mitigate some of those symptoms potentially, or just get on the right track so they're as well positioned as possible kind of heading into perimenopause?
Mhm. Mhm. Now, again, I'm not an expert, but what I do want women to understand is the quality of food
Mhm.
that we intake, especially when we're looking at food types, such as how we're preparing our food is a big part of
Mhm.
that. And also what food groups we're choosing to focus on. So, for obvious reasons, we live in a very diet heavy society
Mhm.
that pushes diets,
Mhm.
but what that doesn't push is longevity or sustainability by
Yeah.
any means.
Yeah.
And so,
Restriction
how
is
I
not the
try to
path.
switch, right, exactly, right?
No.
And I really try to change the construct of, I want you to be able to do something that is so long term that you don't even think of it,
Mm.
that 20 years from now you truly understand. Our brain is actually very smart, which is why it's the brain. And if we can hardwire it to some really good, I guess you can say, techniques and habits,
Mhm.
that's really where we're going to see the end result. So it's the small changes that you make, not the drastic changes of, I'm dropping
Mm.
this from my diet or I'm dropping this from my
Right.
diet,
Right.
is going to give us that outcome that we're looking for. And that's usually why, again, I mean, we have not seen data that shows that diet has a very good long-term result of what we're looking for. Most people, when
Hmm.
they're off a diet, they either gain the weight back, or if we're
Right.
looking at it from a lab metabolic perspective, we'll usually go back to what they were before, because there's no true long-term change.
Hmm.
So when I'm counseling women about nutrition, which is another beautiful thing that I have about my practice, is that we have a registered dietitian on
Hmm.
staff, because my job is to kind of get the wheel starting on,
Hmm.
when you're in my exam room and we're talking about perimenopause and menopause. Here's how I want to bring into the conversation
Hmm.
nutrition, and here's who's going to continue that conversation for you and get you on the right path, is our
Amazing.
registered dietitian. But some of the same things that you brought up as well is having that 3 hour. I actually do talk
Mm.
about that a lot. Is like, I
Good.
ask women, well, when is your last meal, and
Yeah.
when do you go to sleep? And so we may hit on some of those as well. Also, intermittent fasting.
Hmm.
What we're kind of giving ourselves, what is that time frame that we're giving
Hmm.
ourselves on when we should be having most of our food
Hmm.
intake, and not necessarily always from a weight loss perspective,
Right.
but also from a hormonal perspective, and what we're giving our bodies the best ability from a hormonal level, but
Hmm.
also from a metabolic perspective, to do the work that it needs to do.
Hmm.
And moving away from the I have to eat all day.
Hmm.
And when we look at postmenopausal women and we look at those changes of those hormones,
Hmm.
we know that in the, whether you want to have a 6 or 8 hour time frame, you're going to see changes in insulin resistance. You're going to
Hmm.
see changes in biomarkers for oxidative stress. And
Hmm.
so when we think of making those small steps, that is another way to have different eating strategies that's going
Hmm.
to, in the outcome, give you some of the benefits of
Hmm.
weight maintenance. And I'm focusing on that word weight maintenance more than weight loss, is because we do see through the perimenopause and menopausal phase, and I had said this earlier, is that we do just start to see differences in fat distribution and weight gain. And so I like to look at it from a point of, from where you are right now, how can we maintain where you are? Or how can we maybe get some perks, if that's what you're looking for individually, of weight loss? But that comes through those small steps.
Yeah. So building muscle, prioritizing
Yep.
protein would be, two
And
really
sleep.
big steps. And getting sleep so you
Yeah.
have the exercise capacity, and that and your hormones, your signaling hormones are regulated. Yeah, you intermittent fasting I think is always a really interesting topic, and I
Hmm.
always like want to point out that time restricted eating and intermittent fasting are actually two different things. There's a circadian component
Hmm.
to time restricted eating, and there isn't a circadian component to intermittent fasting. And I think if people are looking to optimize their hormones, and I think mitigate a lot of the symptoms, I think a time restricted eating where you're biasing a bulk of your calories in the front end of the day when the light is
Hmm.
out, as opposed to the back end of the day, I think that can really help, sleep, for example. And again, this is a gal who's in a lot of data, right? So I'm not just talking off the cuff. I can tell you that, we want to bias our
Right.
calories earlier in the day. So I think intermittent fasting, I think, can be an incredible strategy. But I almost think, uh, and I would love to hear your opinion on this. I think for women who are
Hmm.
trying to really stabilize their hormones and stabilize sleep, thinking about a more of a time restricted eating window, and
Hmm.
prioritizing a bulk of the calories when the sun is up, and then giving that 3 hour buffer prior to when they sleep, to me follows the circadian rhythm, and I think sets us up, I think, for optimizing our insulin levels, and I think preventing a lot of the metabolic issues that come with just eating over 17-hour window, for example, which is what a majority of Americans do, right? Or
And I wanted to
fasting.
ask you that.
Yeah.
This is for
Yeah.
selfish reasons.
Yeah.
How did we get so far off of the
It's just
the cusp
modernity,
of that? I
it's just
just
light. We have access to light. I think too, like, and this is, you know, t- I'm constantly thinking about, how we get off track and how do we get it back on track. And definitely,
Hmm.
obviously, having constant access to light, but constant access to food. We're not having to go out and hunt
Hmm.
our elk and
That's
then
it.
cook it by the
It's like
fire.
always in our
We
face.
have a fridge right there that is accessible 24/7. Like, we are never
Or
without
driving down the street.
access. I know we can. I know. So I really think we need to just, if we just reeled in our timing of when we eat and restrict the timing, I think we'd probably solve a majority of our metabolic issues. Honestly, without a doubt, there's quality issues, right? In terms of, you mentioned it in the beginning, the processed food. We need to find a way, to help Americans minimize the amount of processed food. And this is a big project, of course. But I think if we could just start by kind of narrowing our window of time that we're eating, we will help ourselves massively in eating, when it's light out during the active phase of our circadian rhythm. Like, this will get us so far. And I think will help women and men, any individual, any
Mm-hmm.
person who is trying to gain more control, more balance, be able to be alert when they want to be alert and sleepy when they want to be sleepy, and have exercise capacity, to move their body in a way that they want to move their body. I mean, I think, to me, the root of all this is in large part around timing,
I really appreciate what you just said, because what I deal with in my practice, and
Yeah.
I deal with mostly menopausal and sexual health, is these this change or this time frame in a woman's life is so detrimental to how it plays out in your 60s, 70s, and 80s. And
Yeah.
that's why I really focus on the 40s and 50s, because we really have the ability to change the trajectory at this point. I think that has a lot to
Right.
do with mindset. Um, One of the things that I'm like
Love
an
that.
advocate for, and I preach it to all my patients, and that's what we offer here at my practice, you know, is trauma recovery. We do
Mm,
sex and intimacy coaching, because there's such a big shift in mindset of how we may need to take on new habits, how we
yeah.
think of ourselves, how we show up in life, and how we're treated, quite frankly, from society. Like, I mean, you hear this all the time, is that after a certain time frame, women just kind of are not given the respect or the time or the luxury of having power. And I think mindset and being able to give yourself back that power, and empowering
Yeah.
ourselves, is such a big part of taking on these new, and I don't want to call it challenges, because it physiologically, everything that happens during perimenopause and menopause is going to happen. But
Yeah.
how do we change the ability for women to understand this in a way where it's not negative? We've put such a negative
Mm,
connotation on
yeah.
menopause. And I'm really like, my passion over these next few years, and maybe for the rest of my life, is to change, like, how do we change that conversation, and how do we identify some of the things that are taking away the ability for women to say, this should not change my value or my attitude or my
Mm,
behavior, and wanting to take an active, be an active participant in this transition.
yeah. I feel like mindset obviously can be an incredibly powerful um, affector, in so many ways. And I think, like, just what you've outlined in this conversation is there's kind of a foundation of behaviors, that are going to help us if we're in our 20s, in our 30s, in our 40s. It doesn't matter, right? There's these foundational set of behaviors. And you mentioned sleep, you mentioned exercise, you mentioned nutrition, and we got to get these right, and they're
Yeah,
going to change a little bit in terms of our needs across our lifetime, and we need to kind of keep track of how we're doing across these different pillars. But if we don't have this foundation right, it's hard to talk ourselves into a better future, right? With
yeah,
from a mindset perspective. So it's kind of like you've got this approach where, all right, let's get the foundation right. Let's establish like a lot of efficacy, or a lot of self-efficacy in these areas, and then I feel empowered and more control over my health. So then tweaking
exactly.
that mindset becomes a little bit more achievable, right? Like, we can
Hmm.
talk ourselves around some of
Right?
these, inconveniences, I think, right?
Because it's the small changes, just like you
Yeah.
said. If there
Yeah.
are, if we're going through this journey and we're empowered, we have really good foundation, those things that may come up here and there, we have the ability to make those small changes because it's not this like huge undertaking or this, I now have to change everything in my life. But
Right.
if I can give someone the tools early on and
Hmm.
they have taken a good portion of those tools from early on, those changes that come later, every 5 years, 10 years, so much easier for us to handle than
Yeah.
being like, I have to change the whole system and rerun the whole engine. And I mean, that's hard and no one
Yeah.
wants to do that. And that's kind of
Yeah.
what we are seeing now today is we wait for menopause to happen. Then we're like, oh, by the way, because this stuff has been happening over the last 10 years, I'm going to need you to do a complete overhaul in how you think, what you
Yeah.
changes you need to make,
Yeah.
and
It's
then we'll be good.
overwhelming.
Most people are going to be like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why
Totally.
we got to get this conversation started so much earlier.
I love it. I love it. I mean, you're doing so much to raise awareness. I mean, I already feel like just in the last 2 years, I think just women's health is just emerged
Yeah.
as like a topic. I
Hmm.
mean, it's amazing. And you're a big reason for that. Other leaders like yourself in this space who are really speaking out and
Thank you.
normalizing a lot of these conversations. It's just pause and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in this area. I think, one of the things that one of the questions that we get from our members is about just the health risks. So,
Hmm.
you know, I guess, is there a case to be made for being proactive in these kind of years leading into perimenopause and menopause? How do we mitigate the risks of osteoporosis and weight gain and urinary tract infections, heart disease,
Yes.
things that happen in that postmenopausal period? Obviously, you've already mentioned a lot of things that we need to do to that foundation, I guess we go back to. So is there anything else that we need to do to kind of minimize risk? And then let's just say we've got folks who are in postmenopause, so they've already hit menopause, they're in
Hmm.
postmenopause, and the risks are of these things start to increase. What can we do pre, if anything we have missed, and what can we do
Hmm.
post?
I would say if I were to like write a recipe
Mm,
for decreasing risk, and before I even go into that, I want to like highlight the risks of what we see with menopause,
mm,
mainly due to literally a decrease and depletion, if you want to call it that, of estrogen. So what we know is that with the decrease in estrogen, you're going to see an increase in heart disease. And that has to do, again, with the actual muscle of the heart. And that has a decrease, kind of uh, work ethic, I guess you could say, of the heart
I love
muscle.
that.
You start to see more heart failure, right? It's like, yeah,
You're
I'm kind
so
of tired
good.
now. Uh, right. And then
It's so good.
also, how our cholesterol, so our LDL levels will increase. And
Mm,
we know the higher your LDL levels are, that's going to contribute more to what we call atherosclerotic change, which causes plaque,
mm,
which causes heart disease, etc. We do start to see changes in type 2 diabetes. And that's because we see changes in our insulin and glucose ratios, how insulin is utilized, and sensitivity as well. And then we also see changes in metabolic syndrome. And that has to do with, again, our visceral fat, our lean body mass, our lipid profiles. And those all create what we call the changes in our body constitution, how we distribute fat, and then brain health. Very big thing that we're starting to see in how decrease in estrogen is going to increase a risk of Alzheimer's disease, dementia,
mhm,
etc., and our
mhm,
cognitive function.
mhm,
So that's another reason why we have to pay attention to that as well. And also colon cancer,
mhm,
and then bone health. Bone health
mhm,
again. So when do you typically start to see, your hip fractures, your wrist fractures, etc., is after menopause because we have a
mhm,
decrease in estrogen, and estrogen induces what we call like the buildup of our bones. So if you have a decrease
mhm,
in estrogen, your bones are not being built up to the, what they used to in the past when you had estrogen exposure.
mhm,
And so you start to see more osteoporosis, more bone
mhm,
loss, and that's when you start to see more of your fractures. And
mhm,
so if you were to look at it from that perspective alone,
mhm,
you're like, what can I do to help ensure that I'm giving myself the best bet and the best quality of life? Because we're all going to age, but we also have the ability to choose how we like to age. And that comes in the forms of how can I improve my quality of life? And that comes with, I'm going to give you the recipe now. Everyone ready?
Love
I
it.
had a long, kind of prelude there. The recipe is looking at hormone replacement therapy differently. Just giving yourself the ability to have the conversation with someone who's very well versed in it and how they can provide you what is my risk if I were to start hormone replacement therapy? Do I have risk factors? And how can I
Mhm,
use it to my benefit? Next, I would say nutrition. Nutrition
mhm,
is ever so important. How we conceptualize food as medicine. Third, I would say exercise. One, you
mhm,
need to exercise. That's the recipe. And if you do
mhm,
exercise already, changing how we exercise. So, for example,
mhm,
increasing your weight bearing activity
mhm.
and weight training to help implement your bone health and longevity and sustainability. And then last, I would say sleep. Now, even me, I don't think I realized how important sleep was. And Whoop is obviously helping me see how poorly I'm doing in that department. I'm not going to say that I have everything together, but sleep. So, that, and the last one I would say, so I have a recipe of five, is
Mhm,
really mindfulness in the form of meditation, yoga, breathing techniques. That's something
mm.
that I feel has impacted our lives and
So
my life
getting
specifically so much, but can help so many women.
Yeah, so getting cortisol in
That's
check,
the recipe. That's it.
and that's gonna help sleep, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think women just take on stress differently. Men are stressed too, where everyone is stressed, and
Hmm.
but I think proactively mitigating stress throughout the day obviously is really important, right? That's gonna impact
Yeah,
our
because
ability to
stress
fall
is going to
asleep
be
and
there.
stay asleep. It's gonna be there. It's
Yes,
just a matter
it's going to
of
be there.
dealing with it, in an appropriate
Hmm. Hmm.
way, and being able to
Yeah.
measure the amount of stress that's being put on our bodies physically, but cognitively and emotionally, and then just taking steps to to kind of, I guess, map that stress with appropriate amounts of rest, essentially. And I
Right.
think breathing can be an incredible form of that. The one thing, one I would maybe add to the recipe, and I thought about it
Yeah, I
as you were
want to hear.
talking,
Oh,
is,
you let's put some additions in that recipe.
well, I just think, I think sleep, stress, strength, stress, and social. If I put all S's,
Oh,
my teacher side of me is coming in. But
yeah.
social connection, Peter Tia, and I have not read this, so please forgive me. I'm going to butcher the heck out of this, but it was a mouse study, but they basically saw a connection between plaque buildup, um, in I think it was bunnies. So the
Oh,
bunnies that had more social connection, so were petted and were around humans in like a kind of a social connection type of way, had less plaque um, than the control group who didn't have access to, who weren't petted, who were just basically in a cage and left on their own. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know. I need to read the study,
mm-hmm.
but we know social connection is really important. And I think it's important for
It
women
is.
of all ages, right? But I think especially as we're
Yes.
transitioning into this next phase of life, making sure that our social connections are really strong and that we feel like we have community, I feel is
Yes.
probably a really big piece of the puzzle too.
I don't know. There was a recent interview. Jane Fonda was giving an interview. Did you see that? And she was
Oh
talking
my gosh,
about,
I love her.
in her age, how social connection is so important,
Yeah.
being intentional with her friendships. And I was
Yeah.
like, that was just like a beautiful way for her to have expressed it. But
Mm.
it really runs along with what you just said about the social connection.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's not just, I think you said intention, and I think quality social connections. I think we can be a part of the wrong communities,
Yeah.
and wrong
Yeah.
for us, and I think really evaluating, what what actually are my needs, as a human being, and what type of connections do I need in order to be the best version of myself, and kind of having
Mm-hmm.
a more
Mm-hmm.
intentional
Mm-hmm.
conversation with oneself
Yeah.
around that, I think is really key for every stage of life. But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's certainly when there's lots of changes happening in our body that
Yeah.
can really be disruptive. And I think having that stability around us is really important. Oh, this will be a good one. Um, you kind of talked about this a little bit, but Don Lemon from CNN recently
Yes.
stated that a woman is only considered to be in their prime in 20s, 30s, and maybe 40s. Go.
So I, when I heard it, I was like, surely he did not mean it that way. And then like there's two sides to this. I think one, I think he didn't realize the words that were coming out of his mouth.
Yeah, I think it
Be-
can happen.
I think when he looked back at it, he was like, what was I saying? And, you know, for me who does a lot of media, sometimes there are times you're just talking and you're like, what
What the hell am
kind
I
of
saying?
nonsense did I just say?
I know.
Um,
Happens to me
and
way too often. Ugh.
yes. And so I was trying to give him grace there.
Mm,
But then I also think that there is this strong societal belief
mm,
of women, and that comes from sexism and patriarchy, that people it's kind of rooted in them because that's what society has bred.
right.
And so I do believe that there is some truth to maybe how he
Yeah,
perceived that. But then again, on the other side, like he is very forward thinking,
totally.
and so I think that it was this combination of, oh, maybe that is something that I didn't realize was deep rooted in me, but
Yeah.
I don't necessarily believe it. But I don't think it had ever become a topic of conversation in his head
Hmm.
until it was said,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so I do try to give him grace, but if like he were in front of me, I'd have been like, so what did you mean? You know,
Yeah.
I'm always big about accountability, because if he were, and I think, granted, I don't know him and sit down and talk to him. I believe if I were having a conversation with him, I do believe he could introspectively look at that comment and see
Hmm.
how it was wrong,
Hmm.
and maybe taking the steps to understand why he thinks that, or why
Yeah.
it came up that, or came out of
Yeah.
his mouth that way. And I think that there are a lot of people who do have a lot of bias, whether it's like
Hmm.
sexism, racism, whatever it is, but don't know that it's there until
Yeah.
it comes up in conversation, or they're
Yeah.
charged with a question and that's how they reveal their answer.
Yeah.
My true value of a person is we all have those moments of,
Hmm.
I didn't know that I thought that.
Yeah.
But when it does come up, what are you doing to evaluate, self reflect, understand what needs to be changed, and making those changes?
Love that.
And if someone doesn't have the ability to do that, that's what I can't jive with.
Right.
But if someone has the ability to say, you know what, that was kind of messed up what I said. And I'm going to take accountability for it. And not only am I going to take accountability for it, I'm actually going to do the steps that's needed to understand where it came from and what I can do to
Mhm.
change it.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I'm like, well, that's just BS, you know.
Mm.
But we have to be responsible. We have to be
Yeah.
socially responsible and also self-responsible.
It's beautifully said. Yeah. I think, when as we I think as we become more educated about the things that we can do to, I think, improve our health over our lifespan. And
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of incredible examples of women getting stronger and building muscle, and
Yes.
starting to think more proactively about nutrition, and really trying to make sure that you know are limiting alcohol, knowing that that is going
Mhm.
to really impact sleep and exasperate, these symptoms potentially. I think so. There's a lot of, like, I think, really good examples of women who are speaking out about that, and are,
Correct.
and are kind of walking the walk. How do you
Mhm.
see, if you're to think about kind of this whole women's health space, particularly as it relates to kind of this perimenopause, menopause group, like, what's your vision for the space, I think, in 10 years? Like, where would you love to see it in 10
Oh, I
years?
like that question. Where do I see women's health or menopausal health, or how we work ourselves into this next chapter of our lives? Where do I see that in the next 10 years? I see, because of things such as wearable devices such as Whoop, I see it being, because we have more visibility to menopausal health. The New York Times just recently came out with an article, Women Have Been Misled in Menopause, and continuing efforts from experts such as myself and others in our community. I think we are going to see a phenomenal change. I think it's high time that we do. But I also see the community coming together to want more questions, to probe for more answers. And that's really where we're going to see the change, is when we start to see the change in the women understanding that they don't necessarily have to go through this transition that way, and that they want answers. And that's where we're going to see practitioners understanding how to not treat the disease, but treat the person. And fundamentally, we are going to do ourselves so much better when we're able to understand health and wellness in a perspective of the individual rather than the disease.
I love that. It's a beautiful answer. And I know for my perspective, and just I have a daughter, and I think about her future a ton, obviously, and it's efforts from folks like yourself, who are really, I think, changing the game for all of us, and what that future actually looks like. So cannot thank you enough for how dedicated you are to this space, and how brave you've been, just like pushing on this conversation and forcing these conversations, frankly. It's you're super inspiring, and just feel really grateful to be able to work with you on our science advisory council, and be able to bring your intelligence and insight into our platform for our members. Just can't thank you enough. So appreciate you today
Thank
and
you.
every day.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I really look forward to what we're going to see with data from WHOOP in helping women during this transition.
Thank you. Dr. Shepard, where can folks find you to just follow all the incredible work that you're doing?
Yeah, I really put as much information that I can on my Instagram is probably the best. It's Jessica Shepard MD,
Amazing.
JESSICA SHEPHERD MD. And I really give as much context as I can on any aspect of menopause on there, and would love to hear people's questions so I can answer it that way. But join me there and follow me there. And also for my practice, Sanctum Med and Wellness here in Dallas. On Instagram, we are Sanctum, SANCTUM, Med, MED, Wellness, WELLNESS.
Amazing. And when you are on the Today Show or Good Morning America or Dr. Oz, do you post that on Instagram so people can tune in live if they want to?
Yeah, I do. And I
Okay.
love to hear the feedback and again, what people want to understand more about this so I can
Mhm.
make it applicable to them.
Yeah. And would you say no question is out of bounds
No, no questions out
related
of
to,
bounds.
to
And
health?
also,
Yeah.
if I don't know the answer, I will send you to the person who does.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you again. And I know we'll be chatting soon. Thank you.
Thanks again to Dr. Jessica Shepard for joining us this week to discuss menopause, perimenopause, and the women's health space. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop podcast, please leave us a rating or review. Check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. If you have a question, email us podcast@whoop.com. Call us 508-443-4952. New members can use the code WILL, get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. That's whoop.com. You can join now for our lowest rates ever. And that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you next week on the Whoop podcast. Stay healthy and stay in the green.